This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Starting today's show is David Schemm, State Executive Director for the Kansas Farm Service Agency, as he provides an update on programs and a summary of stats from the 2025 fiscal year at FSA. The 2025 Roscoe Ellis Jr. lecturer, Sasha Kravchenko, keeps the show moving by discussing her research on soil pores as habitats for microorganisms. Brad White, Todd Gunderson, and Bob Larson with the Beef Cattle Institute end the show as they describe how to identify anemia in adult cattle. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Wednesday show hearing from the Farm Service Agency. And today we're joined by State Executive Director of the Kansas Farm Service Agency, David Schemm. David, thanks for joining us today.
Good morning, Shelby.
David, today wanting to provide some overall updates from the Farm Service Agency here in Kansas, and beginning with a recent announcement for livestock producers.
Absolutely, Shelby. So just here recently, this last week, and opened up with sign up today is what we are calling the ELRP, or the Emergency Livestock Recovery Program there. Specifically, Shelby, this program is targeted for producers who were affected by wildfires and or floods in 2023 and 2024. If producers are wondering, this is all tied into that additional disaster assistance that Congress passed last year that I know a lot of producers have already been receiving associated with the Supplemental Disaster Recovery Program. And this is the livestock portion of that disaster program. Approximately around $2 billion are allocated towards this program, but was just opened up here for the state. So definitely would encourage any of our livestock producers in 2023 or 2024 that were affected by wildfires or floods, go in, talk with your county office there, and be able to sign up for this program, providing them with the documentation that they're going to be need, showing that they were affected by either a wildfire or a flood.
When we're thinking about a flood, is there a certain stat or measurement that has to be met to actually be considered a flood when looking at these programs?
With all of our programs, a lot of times we have various, things that need to be hit, target levels that need to be hit. In the situation that we're dealing with here in our state on the producers that were affected on them, basically what we're needing from them is evidence documenting that they were impacted and lost either livestock or grazing due to flooding or wildfires there. So again, as they go in and talk to their county office, they'll help to be able to guide them through that. But in the back of their mind, think about if they were affected by that wildfire, what did it cost them when it comes to their livestock, both, either a physical loss or that forage or grazing loss that they may have had, and, additional costs that they may have incurred by having to buy, forage or feed for those animals there. So again, it's a direct impact that producer would have suffered to those disasters there. Having that evidence is should be a lot of resources for them to be able to get out there, but that's going to be a key component for it, Shelby.
David, do you also have an update for us when it comes to the Supplemental Disaster Relief Program?
That program has definitely greatly affected our state here, and it's one that our offices have been working on very hard. The great thing is that we had to I shouldn't say it was a great thing, Shelby. It was a bad thing that our producer got affected by disasters in 23 and 24. But I think the great thing about that is our offices have been aware of how bad it's impacted and worked very hard and quickly to get those applications filled for our producers. We're 85% done, according to the numbers that we have, with over $600 million that we have sent out to our producers across the state there. So obviously that's a lot of evidence into how much it's impacted our producers across the state there. And offices continue to work on that, finishing getting that last bit of producers signed up and those payments out the door to try to help those producers.
Is there another program that your offices are also continuing to work on?
I think one thing that our producers know, Shelby, and I know I fully well know, is our offices are never short on things to be able to do and things that they can be doing. Especially as we come up towards, quote unquote, the end of our fiscal year at the end of the month there. But yeah, there are some other things that we're working on. ECAP program, emergency program there, disaster program there, that a lot of producers have received payments on it. There's a little bit of expansion of authority for our ECAP program there to allow subsequent crops, or double crops, as a lot of our producers like to call it, to be able to sign up there. And I know offices have been working with those producers that do grow a subsequent crop, i.e. soybeans, possibly grain sorghum behind their wheat there. Some of those producers that are affected by that ECAP expansion, they're also working on that. And of course, another big one, and when we, especially if we start to talk about our conservation, is our CRP. I know a lot of producers have been notified as far as approval, whether or not they were accepted by their contracts, and offices are busy on working with our producers of getting all the necessary signatures that they need to make sure those producers are signed up for those CRP programs there. So definitely encourage our producers there, if our offices haven't already, reached out to them, and that they did apply for a CRP program there, to get a hold of your county office and make sure you get time scheduled to get in there and get signed up.
You mentioned that your guys' fiscal year is coming to a close, your next one starting October 1st. And does your farm program have some summary stats as we look on last year and the previous year?
Absolutely, Shelby. It's kind of neat. At the end of every fiscal year there, we put together kind of a summary that we see from what we have as far as data looking across the state each year there. And our staff is just finished compiling stuff and getting a lot of that information to me. And it's always definitely interesting observing some of the data when we look between those 2 years, between fiscal year 24 and fiscal year 25 here. I always find it really interesting as I look in that, just kind of hitting on some of the highlights that I see here when I look at these data, Shelby. Number of farms in the state currently for fiscal year 2025, we're looking at 177,000 farms in the state, just a little bit over that. But then when we actually look at farm operators and tenants, we actually are looking at 71,000 and a little over 71,900, a little over that there. It's actually pretty static compared to the previous year. We actually show a growth of 4 new operators apparently from one year to another year, and I'm sure there's a lot more dynamics going on behind those numbers than just that there. And even farms in state, we show we're up, over a little over 1,000 farms in the state. A lot of numbers go into that there. Again, I know there's a lot of times a lot of discussion, but cropland acres, we're setting that 29,500,000 cropland acres, and again, we always say, well, there's not new ground created or not created, but we're actually up about 10,000 acres of cropland acres from the previous year, which again is kind of ironic as we look at some of these things there. But again, there always can be some shifts across the state on that there. But, when we start looking of those acres, Shelby, and we look about, the top commodities across the state of what, and it's, again, way FSA looks at things, Shelby, our top commodity when we look at from an acre standpoint is grass across the state. So we have almost a little over 17 million acres of grass across the state. There. Number 2, probably shouldn't surprise too many people based upon what we're known as, and that is the wheat state. So we show just a little over for year 25 of having a little over 8 million acres of wheat that producers harvested in July this year. Corn, we showed at about 6.7 million acres for this year, and soybeans, a little over 4 million acres there. And again, because of the way we look at it, we've got about 2.7 million acres of fallow crop out there. So definitely a component in there. And of course, another one, obviously, that we're definitely known here for in this state. In fact, number 1 state for growing it is our grain sorghum or sorghum crop there, about 2.6 million acres for the fiscal year 25. So that's just kind of the top commodity programs and the number of acres that we look at when we look at this fiscal year 25 there on it. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about another component that obviously takes a lot of acres for our state, and of course that's CRP. And we're looking at this last year here, we had a little over 2 million acres, and again that number stays relatively consistent, slight variations from year to year. But we're looking at a number of contracts here compared to the fiscal year ending in 24 compared to this year. We're actually just a few more CRP contract acres. Again, they're about a little over 100 acres. We're at a little over 28,000 CRP contracts for this year here. So again, just some highlight stuff there. Again, as we're starting to roll into the next fiscal year, obviously that weed acres, we're not even addressing what this upcoming weed acres will be. We obviously don't know what those acres will be like or anything like that. But that's just a little overall view of some of the acres. Obviously we can get into the whole base acres and ARC PLC too, but some neat highlights there, Shelby.
David, as you do round out your fiscal year, anything producers need to come in and get taken care of?
So yeah, Shelby, as we come to the end of the fiscal year, obviously a lot of things going on from our standpoint here as we're trying to wrap up the year for everybody there. But again, a couple of things that producers definitely need to be making aware of there as we roll into the end of the year. Anytime you have any changes, whether it's an estate or if you have a change in tenant or land ownership, obviously make sure that you notify our county offices, get in there and let them know when there are those changes there. That way those county offices can make sure that we have our farm records up to date and current for our producers as we do roll into the next year. As Kansas FSA works on hard to try to make sure we keep our producers served there and preparing for any future programs as they do come down.
That was State Executive Director with the Kansas Farm Service Agency, David Schemm. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Wednesday show talking with the 2025 Roscoe Ellis Jr. lecturer from Michigan State University, Sasha Kravchenko. Sasha, thanks for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for having me. It's a great honor to be invited for the lecture, and very exciting to have this interview.
Sasha, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
So I'm a soil scientist working for Michigan State University. And what I do is I research soil organic matter, that stuff that makes soils as we know it, what makes soil. And I'm the focus of my work is looking at the microscale mechanisms that influence how soil organic matter formed and how it stays in the soil protected and how it contributes to formation of the soil structure.
In your lecture topic titled Soil Pores as Habitats for Microorganisms, and what does that mean?
So most of us, and me too until fairly recently, think of soil as just as that, mushy material that we plow and work on. But actually, if you look at intact soil using either microscope or what are some, other instruments, what you'll see that this is really a very fascinating micro world there. So you can think of a mammoth cave, but in miniature, squeezed to 1 centimeter volume. That's basically how soil pores would look if we look at them closer. So in this very complex network of caves, basically these miniature caves within intact soil, this is where all the actions take place. This is where microorganisms live. This is where plant roots go through. This is where water flows through. And so that pore world. So this is where everyone lives and everything happens.
How do you look at something so small?
We are using X-ray CT, X-ray computer tomography instruments, and this is something that unfortunately I'm familiar with because they applied that to me when I had health issues. This is what doctors would use to look at your bones and your insides. And in our studies, we're using more research version of those X-ray computer tomography machines to scan through the soil, and then we can see where the pores are, where the pieces of stone are, how they position in relation to each other, where plant roots are, where some residues of dead plants or dead insects, or if there is something alive, like an earthworm, we can see that as well. So, yeah, altogether, that's a great tool that really, for me, that opened my eyes on how actually complex and fascinating soil is.
Have you found anything surprising?
Yeah, so I guess what surprised me now I'm trying to remember my first impressions when I had a chance to look at those soil images for the first time. What surprised me is how complex things are and how they're arranged in a way that really makes sense. So again, what surprised me is the complexity and the interactive nature of that soil when we look at it without actually breaking it apart or digging it out.
Do you see differences in what microorganisms are in soil based on where you get it from, what type of field it is, or are they all pretty similar?
So with those tools that we have with X-ray CT, we cannot really see individual microorganisms because they are way too small for that particular tool. We do see, like what I'll be talking about in that presentation, we do see their habitats. We do see the pores. And definitely the organization of that pore system, like how big they are, how well connected or not connected they are, how tortuous they are, what is their shape. So all of those things, they do matter for microbes because they affect how much water they get, how much nutrients they're getting, how much oxygen they're getting. And all those characteristics, they will differ, sometimes very substantially from one soil to the next. That would depend on soil texture, like how much clay, silt, or sand that soil has. It will depend on what the origin of that soil is. Does it come from some, river deposits? Does it come from some, glacial materials? That would affect it. It also is affected by vegetation. So soil under prairie the pore structure, the structure of this pore environment will differ from that, from say under corn field. So there are a lot of things that will affect the organization of those pore systems and the impact that they have on microorganisms.
Why does this research matter to agriculture?
Because basically it's this pore system, as I said earlier, this is how soil functions through. This is where microbes live. This is where roots deposit their root exudates. This is where that roots will be. So the structure will define how well water flows through the soil. It will define whether soil organic matter can be stored and protected, making soil more fertile. It will determine how diverse soil microbial communities can be. It has a lot of influence on how soils will function, and how well they function as the source for crops and yields and things of direct relevance to us as far as agriculture goes.
And Sasha, you've done a lot of research with soil beyond just looking at microorganisms and pores. And so what are those key points that you'd really like to just make farmers and ranchers aware of?
So based on this microscale work as well as more of the field level work. One of the important things that I keep running into again and again in terms of what really makes soils work well is the diversity of the plant communities that are grown. That it really makes a big difference. And one of the sort of big scale focuses of the things that I do is to see what are the characteristics of the diverse plant communities that will optimize that pore structure and this pore organization, and overall that will optimize storage and protection of soil organic matter. So what do we need? Do we need as diverse plant community as possible to have all the benefits, or is there maybe particular plant species in the communities that will make, a particularly strong effect if they are members of the community? So that's sort of like a big part of my work, and specifically I'm looking at what those things do as far as this microscale organization of the soils.
Where do you hope the research goes moving forward?
So from the perspective of my basic questions, I really want to know more about these microenvironments and these micro ecosystems in terms of seeing what are the differences in actual environmental conditions inside them, and who lives there, and why some organisms live in small pores while other organisms live in big pores, and what matters for what would define where they would live. So from more applied perspective, it's, how do we, like what I said earlier, how do we optimize diversification of our plant communities, both used in conventional agriculture, but also in natural vegetation, like restored prairie communities, restored vegetation. How do we optimize the benefits to soil from modifying and manipulating the composition of those plant communities? How do we optimize the soil structural characteristics? How do we increase soil organic matter as much as possible?
Sasha, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me.
That was the 2025 Roscoe Ellis Jr. lecturer from Michigan State University, Sasha Kravchenko. I will put a link in today's show notes on agtoday.net if you would like to learn more about her research. There will also be a link if you'd like to learn more about the Roscoe Ellis Jr. lectures. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today. I'm Madeline Drake, in for Shelby Varner. And we wrap up our Wednesday show with K-State's Brad White, Todd Gunderson, and Bob Larson on the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast.
In the cows, there are a few diseases that we'll see, and a lot of times into this fall season of the year, which can cause anemia. And I wanted to ask you guys, what are the primary clinical signs that I might see in a cow with anemia?
A classic clinical sign you'll see with a cow that has anemia is weakness, maybe being a little disoriented. And occasionally when they get weak and disoriented, they become what we call hypoxic, meaning that they can't effectively transport blood to their tissues and to their brain. And some cows will respond to that by becoming very aggressive and even to the point of being dangerous. So those are some of the signs you might see in a cow grossly from afar as you're looking at that cow. If they go down, or heaven forbid they die, things you might see grossly from a post-mortem standpoint, pale mucous membranes. Occasionally, depending on the cause of the anemia, you may see what's called icterus, or in human medicine, we often refer to it as jaundice, which is that yellow, almost neon appearance to the mucous membranes. So those are all signs that you might see in a cow that is anemic.
Bob, when Todd says So we may have a weak cow, a depressed cow, and he said maybe look at the mucous membranes. Cue me in. Where do you look specifically on the cow?
Well, for one thing, it's a little bit easier in some breeds or some colors than others. So cattle with a white face, so Herefords, Charolais, some Simmentals, those types of things. Even around the nose is a mucous membrane. Right around the eye is another place, or along the vulva. But in white-faced cattle, you can kind of tell that they're kind of pinkish. They got a pinkish hue to the nose, pinkish hue right around the eye. That's the way they're supposed to look. But if they are white, just almost typewriter paper white, that's an indication of anemia. Now, so for black cattle, dark red cattle, things like that, there's more pigment around their eye, around their nose, and those kinds of things. So it's not quite as easy to tell. One area where there's almost never pigment is on the inside of the vulva, and that can look really pale. Now, the problem is, you've got to put your hands on the cattle and really be close to detect that. And so there's some differences between breeds of cattle. It's a little bit easier to pick it up in cattle that have less pigmentation, and you can kind of tell the difference, kind of a pink versus white.
So, Todd, relatively rapid onset to get to this where we have pale or yellow mucous membranes. How long does it take us to get there from the time the cow started to get anemic?
It really depends on the source of the anemia and the cause. There are only 3 ways that an animal can become anemic. One is a rapid loss of blood, so hemorrhage, and usually that's fairly obvious if you have a cow that's bled a lot, unless it's into an internal body space, in which case it might not be obvious. The second way that animals become anemic is through red blood cell destruction, and this is one we commonly see in cattle where something happens internally in that cow, and often there's a parasite involved, and their immune system will actually attack those red blood cells and destroy them. And that can take a few days. Sometimes it can happen pretty quickly, but it usually is going to happen over a period of a few days that they're going to become anemic due to increased red blood cell destruction. The third way they become anemic is they actually just stop producing red blood cells, and that's pretty rare in cows. You might see that in like a bovine leukosis case, but that's going to take a long time to develop.
One of the things that we wanted to talk about today was to make sure you want to observe those cows and see who's maybe lagging behind the herd, and they may be worth getting up. The thing I would add to what you said, Todd, of they can be very fractious, they can be aggressive. So be careful, because if you don't have a lot of oxygen going to your brain, you're not going to make a lot of good decisions, even worse decisions than you normally make.
Right.
So be careful with them. Also, they have no reserve, which means no oxygen carrying capacity to have exercise. So these are cows that we want to be very careful that we don't run, we don't aggravate, we don't get them coming up sooner.
Once again, that was part of the Beef Cattle Institute's Cattle Chat podcast with Brad White, Todd Gunderson, and Bob Larson. To hear the full episode, follow the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or search for Cattle Chat on your favorite podcast streaming platform. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.